Okay, so guys, this will be a kind of extension of our regular meeting, and as I told you before, that he's one of the graduates in Seogang University, and he also tried to do some kind of stuff like a TED talk, and we will do Goma first about this time, and he will do his introduction about himself briefly, so please applaud himself.
Hi guys. Hi. Yes, I feel a little nervous. I think this nervous. But my name is Suwon, and I have graduated from this university with a major of business administration back in 2008, and I entered here in 2002. And I have been working with the company for like over 4 years now in overseas sales department. And in the meantime, I kind of came up with this idea that everyone in Korea, from every country, can have a communication via a single vehicle, which is what we're doing right now, over a variety of issues. Today's talk host is a close friend of mine who came from the United States, who got the master's degree from the University of Southern California in interactive media. He currently works with a company, game creation company. He's a game designer, and the topic that he's going to deal with today is in relation to the creative management. And I believe that most of you, or many of you, have relevant majors doing right now. So he's going to cover the creative management tonight, and how the companies nowadays are dealing with the same issue. So please welcome Mr. Peter Van Dyke.
Hey guys. Like you said, I'm Peter. I went to school at the University of Southern California, and I got a master's degree in interactive media. I did my undergrad there too, but that's not really that important. So most of you guys are business management majors or something related to that, right? Yeah. Some people are nodding. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is fostering creativity and managing creative people, because it's a little bit different than managing somebody who works at a factory or any other type of management. So the first thing that we should talk about is technology in 2012, because this is what's driving growth all over the world and also significantly in Korea. So some of the things that have changed over the last 25 years are the shortening of product cycles. So maybe 25 or 30 years ago, a product cycle might be 2 to 4 years in development, but now we're talking about 6 to 10 months in development. Something like a social game or a mobile game, it could be even less than that. The next thing is something like constantly shifting goals for what you want to be creating. So you have to be thinking ahead. You can't just immediately respond to the market. You have to predict the market. And in addition, you have to be able to predict new markets. So it's not even simply responding to market trends that you see. You have to be able to understand where the markets are going to be going and when new markets are going to be opening up. So how many of you guys have heard of BlackBerry? BlackBerry, Research in Motion. Yeah, most of you probably, right? So Research in Motion is a Canadian company that was created in the 80s. And in the 90s, they got venture funding to create the systems that are behind what became the BlackBerry smartphone, which they released in 2002. And within a couple of years, they had about 40% of the smartphone market. 2 years later, they had 44% of the smartphone market. And 2 years after that, they had 10% of the smartphone market. And so really what this company did is they managed to preempt any of the other companies that were coming into the smartphone market, dominate the market, and then immediately lose their dominant position. And the reason that they did that was because they weren't able to predict what was going to happen to the smartphone market within a couple of years. And it's a big problem. They went from being a company that was worth $60 billion, 2 years later they're worth less than 10. And that wiped out a lot of wealth for their shareholders, and it also put them in a position where they are now not financially stable. And it only took 2 years. So shortening product cycles, market trends are the thing that you really need to pay attention to, and you have to make sure that your company is prepared to do that. So, lessons. Like I said, You predict the trend, you get there early, and you have to do it right. Apple and Google both did this, and they allowed BlackBerry to pioneer the market for them, so they didn't have to develop that. They didn't have to do all that research first. They saved money. The most important way to do this is creativity. And creativity is actually a lot of different things. Creativity will answer all of the questions that you need to answer, new trends, new markets, and being aware of what's going on in the world. If you need to break into a new market, how can you do that? If you have a product and you don't see where you can sell it, that's a thing that creativity can answer. You can create entirely new things. But really, it's all about creative people. So the people that you hire are going to be what determine how profitable and how successful your company is. And I mean, even beyond that, not just hiring creative people, but it has to do with a lot of other things on top of that. And you have to be prepared to get into it. And this is the solution to your problems in 2012 as you go through and start working at your own companies and you start dealing with these issues. So, back in California a couple of years ago, we had this ad campaign that most people who grew up in California would recognize, is that great cheese comes from happy cows, and happy cows come from California. And this works actually really well at a company as well. Great employees do good work. And the reason is because of morale. They're more productive, they're more optimistic, and they're healthier. And now you might think that healthy actually isn't a big deal, but in reality, if you have someone who's been overworked for a long time, their productivity will drop, even though they may work more hours. You want people who are happy to come to work, and happy to be there, and happy to go home and then come back. And actually, one of the most important things about how to create a positive workplace is relationships. And it's not just relationships between people, but also the relationship that your company has with your employees. So these things are slightly different, but they're actually not that different. So when we talk about company-to-employee relationship, there are a couple of things that go into this. And creating a positive company-to-employee relationship has to do with listening to your employees and making them feel like they're a part of a family. They can't just be numbers on a spreadsheet. If they feel like you can just replace them, then they won't really like working there and they won't be very happy there. They may come to work every day because they're incentivized to do that. They may not think that they'll be there the next day, so they try to work really hard. But in reality, in a creative environment, you want employees to want to be there because someone who is happy will actually come up with better ideas more often. And the second biggest thing is respect and confidence. And respect and confidence has to do with the way that your company interacts with your employees as well. So you want your company to have respect for your employees, and your employees need to feel that respect, not just every day, but the way that they deal with evaluations and salary negotiations and all of those kind of things. And having structured goals, individual goals and company goals. Actually, the company goal is really important too. If your company is a company like Samsung, you have a whole bunch of different product divisions, and each product division may have a specific goal. It's really important to remember that company goals translate into employee goals. If the employee feels like they're actually contributing towards a goal the whole company is working towards, they'll feel great, they'll feel productive, and they'll feel like they're helping. And actually, that's really important. And the second thing is employee-to-employee relationships. And actually, these are exactly the same as company-to-employee relationships. It has to do with employees being willing to listen to each other, goals for each other and individual, and respect and confidence on teams. So you have a manager, and they don't listen to the people who are working for them. That's actually a really big problem, because those people might have good ideas, and just because the manager has more experience, they may reject the idea without evaluating it, and that's a really big problem. And that kind of leads us to what the core of this presentation is, which is how to create a positive creative environment. And a positive creative environment is the solution to all of these problems that I've talked about. How to predict trends, how to make sure your employees are happy so that they're solving problems, and how they're creating, and to create good products. Good workplaces create people who want to come to work. There are some rules that are pretty good rules to go by. And the first one is anyone can solve a problem. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone is as good as everyone else at solving problems, but it means that the idea can come from anyone. Now, I don't know if any of you guys know the movie Ratatouille. There's a Pixar movie, Ratatouille. So there's a thing in that's anyone can cook. And it doesn't mean that anyone actually is a chef, but it means that anyone could cook. A chef can come from anywhere. So when you're employing everyone from interns to really experienced managers, it's important to remember that even interns can come up with the solution that you need to a problem that is going to cost your company a lot of money unless you solve it. And that's a really important part of creating an environment where people feel like they can speak up. The second one is anyone can have the next great idea. So this works kind of the same way. It's not just solving problems, but someone says, hey, I have this really cool idea. And your senior management says, that's a stupid idea. That's not a good way to go about managing a team, because you don't know if that idea is good or not. You have to evaluate the idea, not the person. Just because they're an intern doesn't necessarily mean that they're not a good employee, or not creative, or not the smartest person in your company. You don't know. And if you don't allow this to happen, and your competitor does, your competitor might come out with that product that ends up making your business a $7 billion business instead of a $60 billion business. In the case of RIM, they didn't predict the smartphone trend in the consumer market, and now they're in a position where they might not be around in 2 years. It's a really big problem. And the last one is, or that's actually not the last one, we got two more. This one's really important too, and it's trust instead of control. So the company I work at trusts their employees, but often doesn't make them feel like they're trusted. There's a lot of control mechanisms in Korea that I've noticed, and things like clocking in when you get to work, making sure that people are there not for 8 hours, but between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m., making people stay later without pay. It's a really big problem because it means that the company sees the employee as something that can produce something, instead of as someone who is valued by the company. And having too many mechanisms for control is actually a really big issue for that too. And the last one is ask not what your employees can do for you. You're the company. You're the glue that holds your employees together, the reason that they come to work every day. So what you want to do is make sure that you as a company are providing the things they need to do their jobs, basically. If they don't have the tools they need, if they need time off, you have to give it to them. You have to buy things for them so that they are more able to do the things that you hired them to do. If you don't, then you're wasting your employee. And that's an expensive waste of money, especially as salaries keep going up. And kind of on a side note, outside of the office, your employees are still working for your company. They're thinking about things, they're solving problems that they had when they were in the office. And also, their life outside of the office helps to inform and grow the way that they work in the office. So their private life matters a lot. Making sure that they have enough time to build stable relationships outside of the office is really important to them having a positive work experience every day. And happy employees who are happy outside of the office, will do better work inside the office. It's all just statistics. It works really well. I'm going to go through a couple of examples. So there's a company called Double Fine Games. They're based in San Francisco. Tim Schafer works for them. They made a game called Psychonauts, and their most recent game was called Brutal Legend. They used to develop really big games, $40, $50 million projects. And they did a pretty good job of it, and they always made money. But at a certain point, their publisher relationship went sour, and they weren't able to make Brutal Legend 2. And so they were in a position where they had to make something, because they had employees. So what they did was they had 2 weeks of creativity, twice, 2007 and 2009. And they came up with 4 or 5 projects that actually ended up propelling the company to be self-sufficient, to the point where they didn't have to have a publisher relationship to continue paying their employees. And so if you look at it from a point of view of open development, creative, like a really positive creative environment, he was able, Tim Schafer, the guy who leads the company, was able to create an environment that fostered creativity in such a way that ended up saving the company a couple of years later. And he didn't know that this was actually going to be really important, but it ended up being one of the most important things. So, the second one is Google. Maybe you guys have heard of it. It's a pretty big company based in the United States. 95% of search in the US, something like that. They have a bunch of policies that I think really speak to this well. And also, they continue to lead the market after 14 or 15 years in the #1 position. And those things are actually really simple rules. We're talking about 20% time. 20% time is actually a really fantastic thing that's used by a lot of American companies in order to generate new ideas. And what it means is that for every 5 days that employees come to work, 1 of their days is spent doing what they want. It means learning to play piano, or working on a project. Gmail came from this. Most of the Google Labs projects came from this. Google Plus, all of these projects. Things that people see on the market every day from Google came from 20% time. And it's not just that it generates ideas for the company, but it also puts the company in a position where it's giving the employees the ability to better themselves on a regular basis. Every week, people are learning things or doing something they find interesting as opposed to the project that they're assigned to. And on top of that, they have things like flexible working hours. You get to work when you want, you get your work done, and you leave. They have all kinds of intra and extra office benefits. So things like welfare programs that are strong in Korea, but also things like they have a cafe and organic chefs and things like that that are really in the company in order to provide the employees a reason to stay and to do good work. And often employees end up working longer hours because of it, because they're comfortable where they are. They feel like they want to be there. Team mobility is actually a really big deal because in Google, if you do create a project with your 20% time and you have 2 people you want to work with, you can eventually pitch that project to your senior management, and then you'll create a new project with that idea, and you'll have a couple of people, and that'll become a product. And that's where Gmail came from. And all of these things, and these aren't the only reasons why Google is still leading the market, but all of these things helped to drive Google's position. And they'll continue to do so for the foreseeable future. They've hired a lot of really good people, and they've created an environment that these people want to come to every day. And they've given them the ability to do what they want there. So kind of the next thing I want to talk about are like a couple of common problems that I see in Korea right now. The first one is too many rules. So in Korea, there are really strong hierarchical systems in place that are derived from kind of a military history and a whole bunch of other cultural issues. And they're not necessarily bad, but in a creative environment, they put people in a position of being better or worse than someone else without actually evaluation. So I was talking before about creative ideas. Creative ideas come from anywhere. But when you have someone in a position where they feel like they're right, you know, some of the creative ideas aren't going to get through. In fact, most of them probably won't. And eventually, people will stop presenting them. It's a really big problem. At the same time, on the other end of this is a lack of structure. So not having any rules is often as bad as having too many rules. You want to create structures that people can exist within. It allows them to see what they can and can't do, and they can be creative within the structure. The biggest issue is experience is always right. And this is something I run into every day at my company. Because most of the developers are often maybe aged 8, 10 years in the industry, and therefore they think that they are always right. And they're unwilling to consider other ideas. And now they might be right more of the time than someone who's younger than them, but at the same time, you want to make sure that other ideas are evaluated because there's always going to be someone who comes up with a better idea. Eliminating those ideas puts your company in a disadvantage, always. And so relationships are the most important thing. Creative environments determined by relationships. Your employees are people, not numbers. It's really important to remember that. Openness, respect, and confidence within teams. These are really important. And the company is here for the employees. You want to remove obstacles from your company or from your employees. All you want from them is good work. That's your #1 goal as managing creative people. Good work. You have to remove all of the obstacles in between your employees and getting their jobs done. And I guess, do you guys have any questions for me? Yeah.
I thought Apple was the first frontier Apple was at the frontier in the smartphone market, but
Yeah.
it wasn't.
Actually, the first big player in the smartphone market was technically Nokia. And then BlackBerry expanded the market really significantly. And then Apple launched the iPhone, and then Google launched Android. And with Apple and Google's guidance, because they targeted the consumer market, the smartphone market increased by, 10,000% in 2 or 3 years? Yeah.
How long have you been living in Korea?
Year and a half.
Yeah, that actually relates to my following question. Is, this kind of culture comes from what I see, from the way they're educated in the first place.
Yeah.
That sort of hierarchical structure comes like it trickles down from the way that the Korean people are educated, from like elementary school and from their family structure as well. So you have dealt with the problem from within the company, but then is there any sort of way that it can be dealt with from in a more in a bigger picture, like
so
from starting from the education, so that they can be structured in a freer way,
yeah,
or more creative way in the first place.
So all the rules that I went through apply not just to companies but also to education. So in a classroom or something like that, I've heard stories. One of the people I work with, I asked her a lot about her experience in college because she studied at Yonsei doing graphic design and interactive design. So I had a lot of questions for her since she did a program that was actually kind of similar to mine. And one thing that she said happened to her pretty often was she would pitch a project to her teacher, and her teacher would say, "No, that'll never work," which is absolutely the wrong way to approach a creative major, because such a large majority of learning how to do what you do in a creative major is trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing. It guides your ability to make decisions, and it guides your ability to understand the best way to approach problems. And this kind of applies throughout the education system. So in my major, when I was taking my graduate studies, we were basically given you need to do a project. And we had to come up with the project and all the metrics for it and everything that we needed to do. And we all failed all the time. There were like 8 of us, and we probably, among the 8 of us, had 30 failed projects or something like that, which is great, because every one of those projects we failed, but actually each one of those failures was a success because we understood why. And then we were capable of taking that, what was a failure, and turning it into something that's actually quite wonderful. And that allows you to analyze why things work or why things don't, and then move on from there. And that kind of structure, that knowledge, is actually more valuable than almost anything, and that will inform anyone's ability to solve problems in the future in almost any subject. Just evaluation is so important, and it's actually not that common here because there's such a risk aversion. So teachers will tell you that you can't do this or that it won't work. But really, you have to know what will work and what won't, and how to turn something that might not work into something that does work. Not trying is actually not trying is the best way to not succeed. Always, every time. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But there's another question, because nowadays there's Asian, well, I think there's a bit of, how can I say, acceptance of Asian culture as being successful, such as it was not as a recent thing. Traditionally, Japan has become, they actually has proven themselves as being a successful economy throughout the world. That sort of model also applies to that of Korea as well. So you have been picking up a lot. I'm being devil's advocate,
yeah,
but you have been like finding fault with a lot of difficult problems of Asian culture, but then would there be any chance that we can stick with? I mean, is there any hope or way that we can stick with? I mean, despite all the downsides that we have. Well,
I mean, growth isn't a black and white thing. So obviously, the growth of Korea's economy has been between 6 and 12% for like 25 years. That's pretty impressive. But if you look at Japan, I think a good example is most of my knowledge, my background knowledge is in games, so I'm going to use an example from games. So the console market in Japan, Sony, right, PlayStation. Games that were made in Japan used to dominate the market. You would have games that, Final Fantasy is a really good example. 13, 14 different games, and each one of them was a top-selling game for at least 2 weeks, right? That used to be what dominated the video game industry, and now you're in a position, or Japan is in a position where it's largely lost the leader of the video game industry to American companies. Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, these are the games that are at the top of lists now, not Final Fantasy, not the games that were coming out of Japan. And the reason that is because Actually, in Japan, there's a view that inexperienced employees can be an inconvenience because they won't always know the right answer. But in reality, what that means is Japan is in a position where their industry is stagnating a little bit because new employees bring new ideas, and new ideas are what drive the market in different directions. Companies in the United States, and even not companies, just 6 or 7 people in a garage are creating games that are doing so well that they're more profitable than games coming out of companies like Sony. A good example of this is, I don't know, how many of you guys follow the video game industry at all? Just a little bit, to a degree? Well, just a little bit? Okay. Well, at least one person. So there's a company that Sony actually funded for a number of years through 3 projects called That Game Company. And they created, the first game that they released was Flow for PlayStation Network. And then they released Flower. And then they just recently released Journey. And each time they released a game, it was called the best game that is on the PlayStation 3. Every time. And they're the ones that were driving the market. And while they were funded by Sony, they're based in Santa Monica, in Los Angeles. And that's the problem with not paying attention to people who are younger, to always deferring to senior management. Because in fast-moving industries, I mean, we're in a position right now where the mobile market, trends in the mobile market are lasting less time than it takes to develop a game. So what that means is you have to be trying to make something new, because if you don't try to make something new, what you release will already be old before you finish it. And that's not a good place to be. And that's a problem that every video game company is dealing with right now. So in terms of like positive things about the Asian economies, there's like fast follower is great in technology, but in content industries, fast follower is actually going to be in a position where it's not going to work anymore, and there has to be new ideas. However, I mean, you see Nikon and Canon are dominating the camera market. So,
manufacturing.
Yeah, manufacturing. You guys are great. But in terms of creative industry, the way that the system works, it's really important to make sure that people are happy in their workplace because they'll generate better ideas. Actually, I was going to use this example earlier, but I decided not to cut down on time because I know some of you guys have other stuff to do. But back in the 1920s, Henry Ford, you guys have all heard of Ford, right? Huge company. Henry Ford pioneered manufacturing systems that are now used all over the world. And for a long time, people there were working 6 days a week, 60 hours a week. And he actually did an experiment at one of his manufacturing plants where he decreased the number of hours they were working to 40 and 5 days. And that plant was more productive than any of the other plants, even though everyone at that plant were working 30% fewer hours per week. They were producing more, just in terms of numbers. The productivity of not working your employees too much is actually a huge, huge gain. Someone who's 1 hour, like did not get enough sleep by 1 hour or 2 hours, is like between 15 and 20% less productive than someone who got a full night's sleep. Someone who's unhappy coming to work, it's like almost the same thing. It's a big deal. And the gains, especially in the creative industry, are actually huge for that because you have people who are coming to work and creating better ideas more often, coming up with better solutions more often, and then on the other side of that, they're not making mistakes as often, right? Especially with programming. Someone making a really big mistake early in a project can cost so much money and time and development effort. It's really important that people have everything they need. Yeah. So fewer hours, yeah.
Would you say it's better to, well, you're talking about creation a lot and creativity, but isn't that pretty risky for a company? Wouldn't it be better to, instead of inventing your own thing, but instead take what's out in the market and make it better? For instance, Netflix saw the problem with Blockbuster. People didn't want to go out to get a movie, so they created the mailing thing. But now Netflix has lost so much net worth because the creator ended up splitting up. He had some new creation.
Netflix? The biggest problem with Netflix right now is that the content companies don't want to play with them, basically.
There was something in America like a year ago where it was like you either get DVD.
Oh yeah. No,
or you get it streaming,
yeah.
and it cost him like half of his Like
Yeah, they lost about 10% of their subscribers a month after that.
Or 10%.
Yes.
Okay.
No, that was a really big deal. They actually lost a lot of money because of that, and they backtracked, right?
Yeah.
So now it's not like that anymore.
Right, but
So yeah.
people won't go back. So isn't it being the new trendy? Isn't it technically
So yes.
risky and
So
bad?
the way that this bad is a bad word for
Okay.
this because
Not good.
I know. Okay. So for a company that is trying to open up a new market, well, in Netflix's case, let's talk about Netflix for a second. So Netflix made that move in order to try and monetize their user base more. So they wanted to make more money off of one thing and more money off of another. So instead of giving people a combined deal for $12, they would charge them $6 and $10, right? So they're netting, what, $3 or $4 off of every one of their users. Which, when you're a shareholder, you see your user base and say, how can I increase that money per person? That would be really great, right? But if you're Netflix, really the most important thing is having as many subscribers as you can, for the most part. So someone made a decision somewhere in the company, and I don't know who it was, but there was a trade-off that was made, and it was, how happy are my people who are paying me for my service right now, and how much am I making off of them? And someone ran the numbers and said, if I can make 20% more, it's okay if I lose 10% of my subscribers, right? And was that a bad idea? Obviously, right? It didn't turn out very well. If no one had talked about it, it probably wouldn't have mattered as much. Some people would have canceled their Netflix accounts, and they still would have made more money. But because it became like a PR thing and like marketing, people, more and more people started doing it until the point when they backtracked and changed the thing. So, in terms of risk aversion, can it be risky to do things like that? Yes. The majority of the time that it's risky to do something like that is when you're doing something that is a cost benefit for the people you're trying to sell things to. So, for example, in a mobile company right now, like I said, we're getting to the point where market trends are actually becoming shorter than product cycles. So it takes more time to develop a game than it takes for the trends to change. If a company isn't willing to try and do that, they're always going to be late to market. And it's going to get worse, actually. It's not going to get better. So in terms of risk, is it riskier to always be late to market? Or is it riskier to fail on 2 of your 5 projects? I mean, in the grand scheme of things, we're going to get to a point where being late to market is basically the same as not coming to market at all. So in terms of making money, in terms of revenue generation, it's going to be a really big problem. Can't just work like that. And this kind of works in technology too, in hardware. So Samsung's actually doing a pretty good job right now of fast following Apple. But at the same time, they're not putting out new products. They're putting out products that kind of embody some of the design elements that they see from other companies, and therefore they're doing pretty well. They're posting pretty good growth, but they're not leading the market, which means that if someone else introduces something and Samsung doesn't have it, Samsung's not going to be in that market for, what, 8 to 15 months. And if Samsung's trying to develop a platform, if that market is a platform, then Samsung won't have the market, right? So it's kind of a big issue. And I guess the overall answer to your question is, don't just guess. It's always educated guesses, right? And I was talking before about trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing. And what that allows you to do is more accurately predict things like this. Like, could I have sat at Netflix and said, it's probably not a good idea to try and charge people 40% more for something they're paying for right now? Yeah, I could have said that. Someone else did the math and it looked like it was okay, right? But in the grand scheme of things, you think about your users, how am I going to respond if I receive a thing in the mail that says, oh, I'm going to start charging you more, but you're going to get the same thing, and it's going to start next week? Like, it's kind of a big problem. You got to think about your users. That's kind of what it comes down to. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not an easy problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good
yeah.
Yeah.
And it has to do with whether or not you want your company to be in front or
well, I mean,
a close second.
Basically. I guess a question that's related to that is it, do you personally think it's better to have people in your company to create off of what you're producing. So like the Apple iPhone, they've got like generations of iPods plus the iPhones and now the iPad. But at one point, somebody, although it's successful, at some point somebody had to say, I've got an iPad tablet construct, should we build it or not?
Yeah.
So it paid off for Apple, but let's say switching over to like PS3, it had the Blu-ray in it, and really I think that was kind of risky because everybody was using DVD. If it fails, then that's a big product to have fail in the industry.
Well, no, I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah. So, I mean, it always comes down to cost-benefit analysis, right? But in the grand scheme of things, you have to be able to make the educated guess about. So basically, what Sony did with the PS3 is they said, I have so much of the market, I'm going to force Blu-ray on everybody else so that I can get royalties for Blu-ray discs. And Microsoft said, I'm going to do HD DVD. Failed, right? Because Sony had more of the market and they were able to impose that technology on everyone, basically. So was it risky? Yeah. Did they succeed? Barely, right? But at the same time, if they hadn't done it, there's revenue from other parts of their company they wouldn't have. In content industries, it's really risky to not try to do that. It's actually more risky to not try and do that than it is to not do it at all, right? Because you run the risk of losing your position, and you run the risk of losing your brand image, and you run the risk of your developers not being happy and going somewhere else because you're not putting them in a position where they can try, basically. I think that's kind of how I feel about it. Always push forward. I mean, like, the idea is you shoot for the sky, and sometimes you like hit the roof, but at the same time, you're always trying, because if you don't try, then actually you're not in a position where you're going to succeed at all, right? And often, being second because you tried really hard is a pretty good position to be as opposed to seventh, right? Even Apple put a whole lot of effort in, and for a while they were number one, but now they're number two, right? Android has more market share than iOS does, but at the same time, Apple is the only one selling iPhones, right? So in terms of unit sales, Apple's destroying the competition. They're making tons of money, even though they're second. But they pioneer the concepts. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Well, thanks for being a really good crowd.
Thank you.